Today we'll be reading some actual history from two books. The first is The McKees of Virginia and Kentucky by George Wilson McKee. This book was published back in 1891. So this book is going to give some background on the McKee family, who were Scotch-Irish settlers from the county of Ulster in Ireland. We'll hear about some of the events that led so many Scotch-Irish settlers, like the McKees, to immigrate to America. Then we'll read from this book, A History of Rockbridge County, Virginia, by Oren Frederic Morton. This book was published in 1920. We'll hear an account of the Kerr's Creek massacres that occurred in 1759 and again in 1763. This was an attack by Shawnee Indians on the McKees and other settlers of Rockbridge County, Virginia. From my investigations of ancient records and the study of the histories of England, Ireland, and Scotland, I have no doubt whatever that the McKees originated in Ireland, and that quite a company of them, as adventurers, came over to Scotland in the 12th century, during the reign of King William the Lion, to assist him in driving the Danes from the north. It is surmised, of course, that they were attracted there by promises of land, or booty, as men did not in those days, any more than at the present, go about assisting strangers in fighting their battles without the hope of substantial reward. It is nonsense to suppose that these people and others, in their semi-savage condition, went to Scotland imbued with any quixotic notions whatever. They went there to better their state, and to obtain all that was in sight, to use a slang expression of the present day. They went there to stay also, and having done well, these men were rewarded for their services, and to this day they and their descendants have held their own against all comers in their possessions. Having established themselves in the new country, the clan multiplied greatly, and was no doubt added to by accessions from their relatives in Ireland. There were many men about this time, and shortly antecedent to it, attracted to the standards of different leaders through the hope of reward. In this way, William of Normandy recruited his army of professionals from all parts of Europe before he landed on the Sussex coast of England and fought the Battle of Hastings. It is said that there were several companies of Irishmen at Hastings with William, but what the numbers and names were I am not aware. At any rate, adventurers from Ireland appear to have figured considerably in all the troubles in Scotland, especially from the 11th to the 17th centuries. These men remained in Scotland until the religious troubles arose between the Protestants and Catholics from the time of Henry VIII to the time of William III. Some of them still continued in Scotland after these bloody troubles, in which they had all taken a part, were decided, while others emigrated to the north of Ireland. At the time, the province of Ulster was forfeited to the British Crown from the date of the unsuccessful rebellion of the Earls of Tippecanoe and Tyrone. At different periods subsequent to the Reformation, many lowland Scotch people emigrated to the province of Ulster, North Ireland. There they prospered greatly, and maintained unimpaired the manners and customs of the religious faith of the country from which they came. They and their posterity regarded themselves, and were regarded by the Irish of Celtic blood, as Scotch in all essential particulars. Some of these settlers, before leaving their native land, goaded by persecution under the Stuart kings, had borne arms against the British government, and were among the prisoners captured at Bothwell Bridge in 1679. When the Revolution of 1688 occurred, the Scotch-Irish sided with William of Orange. The siege of Londonderry in 1689 is one of the most remarkable events in history. Upon the march northward of the army of James II, says Macaulay, all Lisburn fled to Antrim, and as the foes drew nearer, all Lisburn and Antrim together came pouring into Londonderry. 30,000 Protestants of both sexes and of every age were crowded behind the bulwarks of the city of refuge. The ordinary population of the town and suburbs furnished only about 600 fighting men, but when the siege began, there were 7,300 men armed for defense. Yet notwithstanding their loyalty to the crown as settled by the Revolution and their heroic services, the Scotch-Irish received no favors from the British government, except a miserable pittance doled out to their clergy after a time. Every effort of enlightened statesmen to obtain a relaxation of the stringent laws against dissenters failed, and in 1719 the Protestant emigration to America commenced. In addition to the restrictions on religion, Irish industry and commerce had been systematically repressed. 20,000 people left Ulster on the destruction of the woolen trade in 1698. Many more were driven away by the first passage of the Test Act. The stream had slackened in the hope of some relief. When this hope expired, men of spirit and energy refused to remain in the country. Thenceforward, for more than 50 years, annual shiploads of families poured themselves out from Belfast and Londonderry. England paid dearly for her Irish policy. The fiercest enemies she had in 1776 were the descendants of the Scots-Irish, who had held Ulster against James II. In 1689, when the Irish Parliament under James II assembled in the King's Inn at Dublin, it is well known that many outrageous and oppressive acts were passed by these vindictive bigots against the Saxons and Protestants generally. It was but natural, as they had been previously oppressed, and were simply trying to get even with their oppressors. A bill repealing the Act of Settlement and transferring many thousands of square miles from Saxon to Celtic landlords was brought in and carried by acclamation. Some of the Irish and British nobles, both Protestant and Roman Catholic, who had followed the fortunes of this weak man, implored him to restrain the violence of the rapacious and vindictive Senate which he had convoked. The great act of attainder, than which nothing more infamous or tyrannical was ever known in the history of legislation, was passed by these infuriated men in their eagerness to regain their rights. There was much excuse for them if we go back and investigate history, but their action entailed great suffering upon innocent people who had come into property through due process of law. This caused a great exodus of Protestants from Ireland, and was the occasion of much cruelty, bloodshed, and oppression. At the same time, in Scotland, the violence among all parties accompanying the Revolution and the accession of William and Mary exceeded that of England. The state of affairs in Ireland is well known, and almost beggars description. In Scotland, the McKees, being Presbyterians or Covenanters, were engaged not only in defending themselves against Dundee, but against their hereditary enemies, the Macintoshes. This feud with the Macintoshes had been going on from the 13th century. The remnant of the clan, after a great fight with the Macintoshes in which they were nearly exterminated, partly sought refuge in France, where they intermarried with the Huguenots, and it is said that after the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, they were nearly all murdered by Catholics. Whether this is true or not, it is certain that the survivors fled into Holland, and there joined the army of William, Prince of Orange. They went to Ireland with some of his forces or adherents, and were engaged in the siege of Londonderry, where they acquitted themselves with great gallantry, and suffered patiently the privations of that awful siege. I have attempted to give here a brief sketch of the origin and history of the McKees of Virginia and Kentucky. I have stated only facts so far as I could ascertain them. In 1738, when a large migration of Scotch-Irish Presbyterians to Pennsylvania and the Valley of Virginia took place, some brothers McKee, variously estimated from 5 to 10 or 11 sons of one who had borne a part in the defense of Derry, arrived in America, and first settled near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There they separated, some settling near Wheeling, West Virginia, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and some going to the far west. Two of the brothers, John and Robert, went almost directly to Virginia, about 1757, and settled on a portion of Borden's Grant on Kerr's Creek, in what is now Rockbridge County, about 8 miles northwest of Lexington. In 1760, William, another of the brothers, also removed to Augusta County, Virginia. An account of the descendants of these pioneers, Robert, John, and William, may be found in the statements from several sources which follow. All the traditions of the family refer to Robert as a perfect type of the sturdy old Scotch-Irishman. He was a strict Presbyterian, but by no means an overbearing or aggressive Calvinist. On the contrary, he was a mild-mannered man, and attended strictly to his own business in both religious and secular matters, a trait, by the way, which I am glad to say I have observed in all the McKees I have met. He was a man of the greatest integrity, respected by all who knew him, of sound sense and judgment, and generally what is called a good citizen. I have never heard that he was a man of any particular brilliancy, but his gentle nature and his bucolic tastes would naturally have made him averse to taking any prominent part in public affairs, even if he had had any natural aptitude for them. Gray's stanza well applies to him as to many other good men in this life. Far from the madding crowd's ignoble strife, their sober wishes never learned to stray. Along the cool, sequestered vale of life, they kept the noiseless tenor of their way. I have always heard of John McKee spoken of with the greatest respect and admiration by the Kentucky McKees, but he had not, from all accounts, the mild manner that characterized Robert. Without being exactly turbulent, he was most positive in his language and actions, and in this way made his full share of enemies. It is thought that William McKee, the pioneer, left Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and joined his brothers Robert and John on Kerr's Creek in Rockbridge County, Virginia, about 1760. I have little information as to details on his life, but only know that he had the reputation of being an upright, honorable gentleman and a good citizen in every respect. His descendants in Kentucky have always been noted as men of great integrity and markedly strong character. The settlement on Kerr's Creek was made by white people soon after the grant of land to Borden in 1736. The families located there, consisting of Cunninghams, McKees, Hamiltons, Gilmores, Logans, Irvins, and others, thought themselves to be safe from dangers of more exposed parts of the country. Leaving the site of old Millborough, the Indians passed over Mill Mountain at a low place still called the Indian Trail. Coming on the waters of Bratton's Run, they crossed the North Mountain, where it is now crossed by the road leading from Lexington to the Rockbridge Alum Springs, and where there is a large heap of stone supposed to have been piled up by Indians. From this point they had a full view of the peaceful valley of Kerr's Creek. What is known as the Pontiac War broke out very suddenly in June of 1763, and continued for more than a year. It was a concerted effort on the part of a confederacy of tribes to sweep the whites out of the country beyond the Alleghenies. To a band of Shawnees was assigned the task of operating in the Rockbridge latitude. Their first blow completely destroyed the Greenbrier settlements, and their next attention was given to Jackson's River and the cow pasture. Thence a party crossed Mill and North Mountains to devastate the valley of Kerr's Creek. There were 2 raids into this locality, and there has been some doubt as to their chronological sequence. With respect to the first raid, there was a forewarning. 2 Telford boys returning from school reported seeing a naked man near their path. However, little serious thought seems to have been given to the matter. A few weeks later, 27 Indians were counted from a bluff near the head of the creek. The war party first visited the home of Charles Doherty and killed the whole family. The wife and a daughter of Jacob Cunningham were the next victims. The girl, 10 years of age, was scalped but made a partial recovery. 4 Gilmores and 5 of the 10 members of Robert Hamilton's family were afterwards slain. The Indians did not go any further. Accounts differ as to whether any prisoners were taken by them. They killed 12 persons, and according to one statement, 13 were carried away. With his usual promptness and energy, Charles Lewis of the cow pasture took the lead in raising 3 companies of militia, one headed by himself, the others by John Dickinson and William Christian. The Indians were overtaken near the head of Back Creek in Highland County. It was decided to attack at 3 points. 2 men sent in advance were to fire if they found the enemy had taken alarm. They came upon 2 of the enemy, one leading a horse, the other holding a buck upon it. To avoid discovery, the scouts fired, and Christian's company charged with a yell. The other companies were not quite up, and the Indians escaped with little loss. However, they were overhauled on Straight Fork, 4 miles below the West Virginia line, their camp being revealed by their fire. All were killed except one, and the cook's brains were scattered into his pot. Their carrying poles were seen here many years later, and ancient guns have been found. In the first engagement, the loot was recovered and it was sold for $1,200. On the second visitation in 1763, the Indians were in greater force and made their approach more cautiously. They concealed themselves a day or two at a spring near the head of Kerr's Creek, but moccasin tracks were noticed in a cornfield, and some men detected the camp from a hill. A rumor had come to the settlement that Indians were approaching, but there was little uneasiness. It is nearly certain that the Indians first seen were an advance party, and that this was waiting for a reinforcement. Another probable motive for delay in an attack was to scare the settlers into gathering at some rendezvous so that they might be fallen upon in a mass. If such was the purpose, it was accomplished. The people flocked to the blockhouse of Jonathan Cunningham at Big Spring. Meanwhile, the house of John McKee was attacked, and Mrs. McKee was killed. There are differing accounts of this incident. According to Alexander Bain, Mr. McKee started with his wife and a dog to reach a wooded hill. Their children were at Timber Ridge. Because of her condition, Mrs. McKee was unable to walk fast, and she insisted that her husband should go on and effect his own escape. Before doing so, he hid her in a sinkhole filled with bushes and weeds, but the barking dog betrayed the place of concealment. After the Indians had gone on, she was taken to the house where she soon died. This statement is challenged by the author of the McKees of Virginia and Kentucky. He construes it as a reflection of John McKee's courage and his duty to his wife. He says that some of the settlers did not like this pioneer for his bluntness, and that they set afloat a garbled version of the facts. The author of the book prefers to believe that John McKee had gone to a neighbor's to look after some sick children, and finding on his return that his wife was scalped, he took her to the house. Be this as it may, the murder could not have occurred in the first raid, as some statements affirm. The family Bible gives July 17, 1763 as the date of Mrs. McKee's death. We must now return to the assemblage at Big Spring. A number of the people of the valley were attending a meeting at Timber Ridge, the day being Sunday. Those gathered at Cunningham's were in a field saddling their horses in great haste, in order to join their friends at the meeting house. The secreted foe seized the coveted moment to cut them off from the blockhouse. The scene which followed was witnessed by Mrs. Dale from a covert on a high point. When the alarm reached her, she mounted a stallion colt that had never been ridden, but which proved as gentle as could be desired. The foe was gaining on her, and she dropped her baby into a field of rye. In some manner she afterwards eluded the pursuers, but was too late to reach the blockhouse. A relief party found her baby lying unhurt where it had been left. Such is the story, but it is more probable that the mother recovered the child herself after the raiders had gone away. While the saddling was going on, 2 men started up the creek to reconnoiter, but both were shot down, as also were 2 young men who went to their aid. The onslaught of the foe was immediate, and each Indian singled out his victim. Mrs. Dale said the massacre made her think of boys knocking down chickens with clubs. Some tried to hide in the big pond or in thickets of brush or weeds. All who attempted to resist were cut down. Cunningham himself was killed and his house was burned. There is no record that the Indians suffered any loss in this second attack. According to Samuel Brown, 60 to 80 persons were killed in the 2 Kerr's Creek raids, and 25 to 30 carried away. This is an overstatement. William Patton, who was at Big Spring that day after the massacre, helping to bury the dead, says these were 17 in number. He adds that the burial party was attacked. Among the prisoners, according to Mr. Brown, were Mrs. Jenny Gilmore, her 2 daughters, and a son named John. James, Betsy, Margaret, and Henry Cunningham, and 3 Hamiltons, Archibald, Marion, and Mary. One of the Cunninghams was the girl scalped in the first raid. She returned from captivity and lived about 40 years afterward, but the wound finally developed into a cancerous infection. According to a rather sentimental sketch in one of the county papers, Mary Hamilton was among the killed, and John McCown, her lover, died 2 years later of a broken heart, and was buried by her side at Big Spring. Mr. Waddell says she had a baby in her arms when she was captured. She threw the infant into the weeds, and when she returned from the Indian country, she found its bones where she had left it. Mention has been made of a meeting at Timber Ridge the day of the second massacre. A rumor of the attack reached the congregation at the noon recess, but little was thought of it, since similar alarms had often been given. But an express arrived when the second service was beginning. There was immediate confusion and speedy flight. Some of the Kerr's Creek families sought safety in the Blue Ridge. On the afternoon of the second tragedy, the Indians returned to their camp on North Mountain, where they drank the whiskey found at Cunningham's Still. They became too intoxicated to have put up a good resistance to an assault, yet they had little to fear as there was a general panic throughout the Rockbridge area. The next day, 2 Indians went back, either to see if they were pursued or to look for more liquor. It seems to have been on this occasion when Mrs. Dale saw them shoot at a man who ventured to ride up the valley. This incident constituted the attack mentioned by William Patton. During the march to the Shawnee towns, the Indians brained a fretful child, and threw the baby on the shoulders of a young girl who was killed the next day. At another time, the prisoners were made to pass under an infant pierced by a stake and held over them. On still another occasion, while some of the prisoners were drawing a few leaves of the New Testament for the purpose of preserving them, an Indian rushed up and threw them into the campfire. When the column arrived at the Scioto, the captives were ironically called upon to sing a hymn. Mrs. Gilmore responded by singing Psalm 137, as she had been wont to do at Timber Ridge. It is related that she had stood over the corpse of her husband, fighting desperately and knocking a foeman down. Another Indian rushed up to tomahawk the woman, but his comrade said she was a good warrior, and made him spare her. She and her son were redeemed, but she never knew what became of her daughters. Several other captives were also returned. Some account of the massacres on Kerr's Creek was related many years afterwards by Mrs. Jane Stevenson. She was then living in Kentucky, and her story was reduced to writing by John D. Shane, a minister. Mrs. Stevenson, who was born November 15, 1750, speaks of a girl 4 months older than herself taken at the age of 7 years and held until 1764. The children had gone out with older companions to gather haws, and the narrator escaped capture only by not going so far as the others. At the first raid, an aunt who had 2 children escaped into the woods, the Indians going down the river. But on the second occasion, this aunt and her 3 children were taken, and an uncle and a cousin were killed. 2 of the children died in captivity, but the aunt and the 3rd child were restored. In this second raid, Mrs. Stevenson thinks the Indians had the ground all spied out, and followed a prearranged program. She says that they came in like racehorses and in 2 hours killed or captured 63 persons. One of the prisoners was James Milligan. He escaped on Gauley Mountain and reported having counted 450 captives as the total collected in the entire raid. Mrs. Stevenson was a daughter of James Gay, who lived 7 miles from Kerr's Creek. Her mother, whose maiden name was Jean Warwick, was killed by the Indians around 1759. Mrs. Stevenson relates that the adult male members of the Providence congregation carried their guns to meeting as regular as the congregation went. Mrs. Stevenson says that when the Indians took Kerr's Creek settlement a second time, they were greatly bad, and that it almost seemed as though they would make their way to Williamsburg. They shot the cows mightily with bows and arrows. She moved to Greenbrier in 1775, where there was never a settlement of kinder people, these being great for dancing and singing. But her statement that William Hamilton and Samuel McClung were the only Greenbrier settlers who were not Dutch and half-Dutch cannot be correct at all, unless true of the particular locality where these men settled. It is also to be remembered that she was not yet grown at the time of the doings on Kerr's Creek. As for Milligan, he must have been able to see more than double in order to count 450 prisoners led away, by probably not more than 1/5 as many warriors. It is not known that the settlers of Kerr's Creek had themselves given cause to make their valley a special mark for Indian vengeance. The native venerated the home of his forefathers, and would make a long and perilous journey for no other purpose than to gaze upon a spot known to him only in boyhood, or perhaps only by tradition. It may have been resentment, pure and simple, that led him to visit his fury upon the palefaces who had crowded him out of a choice portion of his hunting grounds. So it is not to be wondered at that the children attending Bunker Hill Schoolhouse near Big Spring had a superstitious horror of the field where the massacre took place. The treaty which ended the Pontiac War stipulated that the Indians should return their white captives, and these were delivered to Colonel Bouquet in November of 1764. However, there were instances where the return did not take place until some time later. According to William Patton, the foray of 1763 was the last that took place on Rockbridge County soil. Yet in the Dunmore War and in the hostilities that continued intermittently from 1777 to 1795, there was always the possibility of still other incursions. The Indian peril was forever removed from Rockbridge County by the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which was secured by General Wayne's victory in the Battle of the Fallen Timbers. So that's the end of the account of the two Kerr's Creek massacres from A History of Rockbridge County, Virginia. Many of the victims of these massacres were Scotch-Irish settlers who had come here from Ulster after being dispossessed of their land in the early 1700s. This story has special significance for me because Robert Hamilton and his wife Margaret McKee were my 7th great-grandparents. Archibald Hamilton, who was killed in the second Kerr's Creek massacre in 1763, was my 8th great-grandfather. The book, The McKees of Virginia and Kentucky, mentions the sons of William McKee, Robert, John, and William, but his youngest daughter, Margaret McKee, also came to Virginia and married Robert Hamilton. The wife of William McKee, Miriam Brown, was said to be descended from William Wallace through her grandmother, Margaret Wallace. One of the Hamiltons who survived these attacks was Jean Hamilton. She was the mother of Joseph Hamilton Daveiss, who would bring charges against Aaron Burr for treasonous activities in 1806. Daveiss is the lawyer who defended William Smothers on murder charges against the riverboat ruffian named Norris, and who died at Tippecanoe in 1811. Margaret Daveiss Hess was the elder sister of Joseph Hamilton Daveiss, and she was my 5th great-grandmother. She clerked in her brother's law office, and she would go on to become the first woman to plead a court case in the U.S. Her daughter, Margaret Hamilton Hess, would eventually move to Texas, where she died in Gonzales in 1871. To provide a historical perspective on the importance of family and the history of one's family, I will end this video by reading the introduction of the book, The McKees of Virginia and Kentucky. I have for several years been engaged in an effort to trace out the origin and history of my own immediate branch of the McKee family in Ireland, Scotland, and America. The name is quite a common one as it is derived from that of a clan, and it is not to be wondered at that the descendants from such a sturdy stock of men should be numerous. Coming to a new country possessing vast possibilities for enterprising, brave, and self-reliant people, it can be readily seen how the original pioneers of the family soon became separated, and how in the course of 2 or 3 generations their descendants were strangers to each other. Their battles and trials in Ireland and Scotland had, from immemorial time, proclaimed them men who, regarding life and material surroundings as mere circumstances, would unhesitatingly peril all in a cause they thought to be just, and would brook no infringements of their rights from any source whatever. Noted ever for their fidelity and courage as border raiders or soldiers in the old country, the official records of the United States will bear testimony from many sources to the uniform gallantry of these people everywhere upon the battlefield, and to their integrity and ability in the performance of duty in the offices entrusted to them by their fellow citizens. In a study or examination of the published official records of the War of the Rebellion, Union and Confederate armies, it is noted that this name, wherever it is cited by either side, receives an honorable mention for gallantry on the field of battle, or for steadfast devotion to principle that was deemed right from the respective points in view. This paper is written simply to give a brief outline or sketch of the history of these people. In addition to a sincere attachment or perhaps an instinctive clannish feeling, which I have always had for my own people, I have ever felt it to be the patriotic duty of American citizens to encourage a spirit of family pride. The family is the unit of government, and to state this matter in a paradoxical way, or in a manner to which I have a perfect right from my Irish heredity, I will say that, in my opinion, a man who has no pride or interest in his family is no man at all. Being intensely American and democratic in my views, I know that I will be understood by all men of sense and acquitted of any intimation of a desire to encourage anything like an aristocracy or oligarchy in this country. On the contrary, I wish to encourage the true aristocracy of virtue, of respectability, of intellect, of patient toil. Thus, in our great American democracy, each man will and ought to stand before his fellow citizens for judgment, not on account of the deeds of his ancestors, but on account of what he has done, or is doing, for the welfare of the commonwealth. Let every man, no matter how humble his descent may be apparently, for if truth were known, he may have some of the best blood in the world in his veins, gather about him the most deserving of his relatives, and do all that he can to elevate and refine them. What I mean is that he may be so situated that he can only assist a few, and therefore he will act wisely in aiding those who seem to be best fitted morally and intellectually to appreciate and profit by the benefit. Let every good man in this country encourage and inculcate a strong family feeling, and in so doing he will not only aid in the preservation of our institutions, but he will exert a potent influence in the elevation and refinement of the people generally. The family influence or pride, separated as it must be in this vast country into many distinct organizations, will serve to engender generous emulations not only among the families, but between the individual members of the same, and it can be readily seen how in a multitudinous democratic court, or congress of families as indicated by the ballot, each jealous of its own rights and interests, the country would be safe from plutocracy on the one hand, and anarchy on the other. The inevitable increase of education, refinement, and emulation resulting from a general interest in this matter could not fail to elevate the entire people of the country, and in so doing perpetuate our democratic institutions. So that's it for this episode. I've made a couple of other shorter videos on the history of Rockbridge County, Virginia that you can check out, and you can also watch my series on the Pennsylvania Germans in the French and Indian War. Many of these Ulsterman settlers either settled or passed through Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. We'll cover more historical events from this time period on future episodes. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.